And it is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Susanna Hecht, who's a professor of urban planning. But I don't think of her like that. I think of her as one of the founders of political ecology and a geographer, and an expert in the Amazon. And she's going to talk a provocative title, Amazonia and the Last Unfinished Page of Genesis, which I think it's going to be an excellent talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Hecht, for agreeing to participate. And I will turn the floor over to you.
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. And the questions that are being raised here and now are extremely important. I met Chris, on an earlier incarnation of thinking about Amazonian archaeology. And basically, it's geographers, have a license to kill. They can do whatever they like. And I happen to end up in a planning school, but I have a secret life as a historian in Geneva. So I'll be giving you a more historical unfolding of this, the interests about LIDAR. And also I want to raise another sort of set of areas of contemplation and thinking about these questions that don't just keep us in the archaeology of the pre-Columbian world, extraordinarily interesting as that is, but also its utility in sort of understanding questions of resilience, questions of contemporary, that is to say, recent history, and also what it might mean for the future. So I'm going to share my screen right now. I've used the phrase, the last unfinished page of Genesis, because I'm taking a direct quotation from Euclides da Cunha, one of the great Brazilian writers, who also did some of the early exploration, well, not early exploration, but late 19th century and early 20th century exploration of Amazonia as part of a exploration team looking to resolve territorial disputes in what is known as the scramble for the Amazon, but is sort of a hidden scramble. I always think that the map always has this sort of big dark green, and so it's hidden the history. Now, what the statement, and I urge you all to read Euclides da Cunha and The Scramble for the Amazon, but because it will help explain some of the history of this region that he always described as, in a certain irony, because he was quite ironic, as a land without history, when of course it's absolutely drenched in history, as we can see from these LIDAR discussions that we've been having. But what he also says, the other part of the phrase, is Amazonia is the last unfinished page of Genesis writing itself. So one of the things is that this is a place that is also a generative place. We know this from evolutionary history and, ecological history, geomorphology, and so on. But it also has an important human historical inscription. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm also going to talk about reasons why LIDAR is exceptionally important now. So let me go on. Well, here's a picture of Euclides wearing those fashionable turn of the century mustaches. And this was, since other people have had pictures of their books, I thought I'd put mine, which is about really Amazonian history in terms of its geopolitics, its indigenous politics, and particularly in the last scramble, which was about rubber. It involved globalized powers, it involved indigenous people, it involved massive migration and failing states. So there might be, well, as they say, history may not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. So I'll be talking a little bit, not just about the past, but about the present and thinking about the future. So I've sort of mentioned its importance for the deep past, but also this intermediate past, I think, is really important. Its use in really tracing how economic forces transformed that region, and actually with the capacity of LIDAR and with other remote sensing technologies, and with ground truthing to start to reconstruct an Amazonian, let's say, socio-biohistory that is extremely important. And certainly if we're going to understand questions of resilience, we're really going to need to know what happened in places that became forests again. Also, I think all of us are concerned about the dynamics of deforestation now. And its contemporary benchmarking is going to be one of the most valuable outputs that you're going to see from LIDAR. Also, it's become very important monitoring, remote sensing monitoring of on various kinds of platforms has become a very important element in sort of socio-environmental politics and also management. That is, if you can't see what's going on, you can't do anything about it. So in some sense, if you think about the early Radam project, which was 1972, it completely transformed how people began to understand the region, not just as looking at it from its rivers or its roads, but looking at it, if you will, from the heavens. So I'm going to go quickly over some review of the past. And, you know, given that the people who are here, you've already been exposed to this. But I also want to mention some things about the new scramble, and that'll be the last part of my talk. So the question that we have right now is, are we going to be seeing an apocalypse or a realignment under flailing states, climate change, and global monoculturalism, whether that's ecological or otherwise? So, or versus a kind of multiple modernisms, bioeconomies, indigenous scientific knowledge as a platform, and hybridity and new forms of Amazonian life. So I know that Carlos Fausto will be talking. We'll have many other interesting commentaries here, but I wanted to raise this almost as kind of a pre-board for some of the other talks. I won't be talking about Amazonian urbanism, although that is an extremely interesting area. It's an area where you could use a lot of LIDAR, because what is going on right now is that if there were never any cities in Amazonia, how could it possibly have been a site of innovation? Well, there's lots of questions we'll talk about having to do with that. Well, if you follow some of, I bet many of you do follow the work of Jose Iriarte, and you might have come across this discussion in the Guaviare state of these extraordinary geoglyphs that have been found there, who they are dating at about 14,000 years. So this keeps, the Amazonian occupation keeps being pushed back. And of course, these are staggeringly beautiful places. I visited the Guaviare actually when it was a center of FARC activity and the expansion of the coca economy, which just goes to show that it's very, environmental history is a very underutilized dynamic in Amazonian studies. Well, many of you have seen this. This is the Beni raised field complexes. This, of course, we talked about last time, yesterday, which is the geoglyph, what we call geoglyphs. I want to actually, I'll be mentioning more these causeways and roads, because actually what you might think of is Amazonia as inhabited in the past by an extraordinary engineering culture whose lineages and lineaments are just coming into focus. Also, just I don't know whether, because I was going in and out on different platforms of to hear different talks. But what you can see here, of course, is many of these geoglyphs and their distribution. There's over 400 now, and I heard for the first time, you know, I thought how sorrowful it was that Denise Sean couldn't be with us, and she was the one of the protagonists of the discovery of these many kinds of what we call geoglyphs. The other thing, which I actually, the reason I have any profile at all in archaeology has to do with Amazonian dark earths. I worked with Daryl Posey in the Kayapo area, and which is right over here. Oop, I'm pointing with my finger, but I realized that perhaps you can't see my finger. But anyway, it's over here. looking at, we were looking at Kayapo soil management, and one of the things that we noticed is that the model that we had for shifting cultivation wasn't making any sense. There was sort of a constant slow burning going on in the fields. The fields were not being abandoned. They didn't have the same kind of profile as adjacent or not cultivated fields or cultivated regions had. And so what became clear is that this dynamic of biochar was changing the soils in ways that made both highly productive and semi-permanent agriculture possible. And also that if you looked at the urban dynamics, you could get a gradient of from sort of no carbon to very high carbon areas in the areas surrounding the cities, the towns, the villages, as a kind of a marker of, and these are kind of middens and refuge piles. So it's an extraordinarily interesting thing. And as you can see, and this is very imprecise, but what you can certainly see is the widespread use of this technology. I'm going to make just a quick point about this. If we think that you can get advanced civilizations in areas that have irrigation, and which make areas that would otherwise be unproductive and not amenable to agriculture or high civilizations, if irrigation makes that possible in places like the Middle East, and if terracing makes imperial and advanced cities and complex societies possible in montane areas where otherwise you couldn't do anything. You can look at the Amazonian dark earths as being a kind of technology that takes generally poor soils and transforms them into the economic base for complex societies. So it's important to keep this in mind when people start to sort of say, but Amazonians, they only run around naked and paint themselves red. They have produced a technology, an occupation technology, a settlement technology on a par with irrigation and terraces, which makes these just as extraordinary. So to go back to this question of the land without history, the picture on your left is a picture taken quite recently in the last 15 years before there's been major shifts. And what this was a review of the Purus River by WWF, pointing out that it was the most intact area. It was pristine Amazonian forest that had never seen the trammeling hand of man. Well, they had not seen the maps done by Euclides da Cunha and his arch rival, his arch foe, Pedro Buenando, which were mapping the level of occupation as a means of determining where the boundary would be between Peru and Brazil on the Purus River, which was a contested area. So what's important to keep in mind here, and this is part of the first part of my talk here, is to really point out that there's been a lot of settlement pulses in and out of Amazonia, and they come and go for different reasons. But the point is that this went on for the better part of a century. This was not, like 10 years of rubber boom. This was a long-term settlement. And also there are many interesting other kinds of settlements around. I won't go into it, but things like missions and so on. This also represents a kind of political ecological boundary between the extraction of caucho, castilla, which you had to cut the tree down to extract the latex, versus the sort of we wouldn't want to call this the perfect ecosystem here, but the management of seringa, hevea. And actually we are, with my colleague from JPL, Sasan Sachi, we are working on looking at what we call D4B4, the dynamics of deforestation prior to the current output, but We also know there was deforestation in the past, but this takes us into current history, and it's an area and a regime where we think that remote sensing technologies of multiple types will be of use. We are mainly looking at it for carbon, but as you know, as was mentioned yesterday, these are younger forests than you think. And one of the reasons they're younger forests has to do with the rubber boom, which was quite ubiquitous, quite monocultural in its focus, and basically all over the place. And basically, I'm just giving you, this is a drawing of Euclides, by Euclides da Cunha, which is, here's the Purus River, here's a little river, Igarapé. But what you also see here are the roads connecting all of these different rubber estates. So this is, here you would have the thing that you saw on the river, but also that these areas were being regularly tapped and for a long time. And so it's important to start to think about what were the kinds of impacts that you would have seen there. And of course, we think that remote sensing technologies have a lot to tell us about what went on. These are some that we've recently mapped that are still in use. You can begin to see, and also the military maps are full of these barraderos, or veraderos as they're called in Spanish. So the point is that there was quite a bit of terrestrial, what we might today call multimodal transport systems that use both land-based movement roads that are still in use, and then river dynamics as well. So in essence, it's this blending of terrestrial with land systems in systems that had been highly integrated between the Andes and the lowlands in the pre-Columbian period, and that also later became integrated into the global rubber economy. So it's important to take a look at these things and to think about the role, not just of LIDAR in the past, glamorous though that is, but also perhaps about the more mundane stories that come across with this. And also the idea that the reason this was the heart of the rubber boom had to do with those images that I showed you early about where the geoglyphs were, and that in fact, the richness of this area as a natural resource zone for an quote unquote uncultivated product really reflected the historical ecology that was being exploited in the contemporary period. The other thing that's often overlooked, even though today we spend all our time biting our nails over the energy economy, and this is, we have a paper right now, it's under review with PNAS, on the wood economy of the rubber period. There are manifests of how many boats. Remember that this was a global commodity without which you couldn't have had the Industrial Revolution. So the demand was high, and there was a lot of stuff going back and forth on this river, whose magnitude in terms of its flow rivaled the Mississippi River. And indeed, Mark Twain wanted to come to the Amazon and be on the Amazon River, and also to introduce the world to coca, which he thought would be a really good idea. He ended up not being original in this idea, but it's wonderful to think about if you'd had Mark Twain in those rough and tumble towns and in the early coca economy and in the rubber economy, instead of life on the Mississippi, life on the Amazon, it would have been great. But that's a parallel universe we can only dream about. And it's too bad we don't have more better writers on Amazonia, but being stuck with Euclides isn't so bad. This gives you an idea perhaps of some of the magnitude of running those steamships back and forth to the mouth of the Amazon, and then they would often shift into coal-fired steamships. You might remember that Bates' entire collections were burned as one of these boats caught fire. Anyway, but that's a story for another time. In any case, you can get a sense now of perhaps the volume of impact that was happening for the rubber boom, not because Hevea wasn't being chopped down like Castilla was, but rather because the stuff things, even though it's a river and can move on its own, you can't get up there without wood, and you move faster if you have wood going down. So One of the things is that environmental history is perhaps underutilized in Amazonia. And I think that this is an area that could really explode. And it also is one of these places where you use the so-called natural archive as well as the human archive. The second thing is that resilience and human occupation are shaping biomass and the historical economies, and they're really important integrative inputs. I'm thinking a lot about Bill Ballet's work, also on the geoglyphs and also his historical work, and the work in the Beni on these kinds of questions of landscape domestication. I think in all our hearts, we're worried about the benchmarking under current policy conditions, which I'll go into in a minute. And the other thing is that we're in the midst of a new scramble. I don't have time to go into the grisly details of the whole thing. I'll just give you a little sketch. But the point is that we're now in a kind of oligarchic, highly globalized, flailing state situation, which is the states aren't really capable of managing or have no interest in it because of the political dynamics. The region is now sort of the national cash cow as the other economies have started to flail, and that Amazonia has always been used in the 20th century as an alternative to agrarian reform, all of which gives you a deforestation profile that is quite astonishing, as I'm sure you know, and I'll show you some slides. Deforestation is something that can be reflected and managed through policy. I'm not going to go through this because this is going to drive you nuts. I beg to differ with Eduardo Neves, whose work and whose friendship I cherish. But actually, the military dictatorship was very interested in deforestation, and there is a whole bunch of deforestation data from this period that shows, it really took quite a bit of effort to pull this down. This is 1992, so Brazil was having the global 92 environmental conference. So they wanted to look good, but then, things sort of exploded. But what you can see is that we sort of move from the military dictatorship. We open up here in 1988. I'm going to talk about the implications of that. And then by the 1990s, we start to go into a socio-environmental model that becomes very important by the early noughts. It lasts until about 2014, when deforestation drops by about 80%, and now it's back up. So we'll have a discussion of that. I'm just putting all of this is just sort of policy periods. I could sit and do a seminar on this for the next 4 hours, but it would hog the thing. Well, one of the things that's important to keep in mind in terms of the political and environmental history of Amazonia is some central events. And one of these was the 1988 Constitutional Convention after the end of the authoritarian period, which ends about 1985. There's a transition. There was no constitution or a militarily elaborated constitution. There's the end of the authoritarian period means that you have to sort of revise the constitution. And what you had was a bunch of indigenous populations, quilombolas, the residents of Afro-descendant communities, various kinds of non-timber forest extractors, fishers, and a lot of different kinds of cohorts coming in to design the question of the new constitution. So it has an environmental and a social dimension to it that is quite unusual in any constitutional thing that you have before. I've put the American founders here because I'm writing from America and because in the United States we so venerate them. And I merely wanted to point out that while we might go, wow, those guys are wearing headdresses and or their chests are naked and stuff. And all of them, they're sort of dressed uniformly. And I just wanted to point out that there are headdresses here, which are wigs, and that they're all dressed uniformly. It's just, this happens to be in a different idiom of which we are less accustomed. But the point is that these constitutions were very important, and also that indigenous populations, Black populations, and so on, were important in the construction of the Brazilian 1988 Constitution, which also commemorates 100 years since emancipation of slaves in Brazil. But this one was inhabited mostly by slave owners and people who would happily exterminate most of the continental indigenous population on the continental United States. Okay. Quickly on 1988, for those of you who are not perhaps familiar with it, it was the ascendance of Brazilian politics within a globalized framework of things like human rights, environmental politics as a regional and global enterprise, the use of financial levers and so on, things like as to control the dynamics of land use, the so-called political supply chain. Some of you might be familiar with the soy moratorium. These often were sort of more rhetorical than real. It's the end of one phase of authoritarian regimes in Latin America. It was a shift really into more what we call neoliberal or neo-extractivist. These terms are often used very loosely, but essentially decentralization, opened economies, restructuring, market-led development. But the other thing so you can have this sort of the opening and the cracking open in globalization, but also the recognition of historical rights of traditional populations to their historical territories. So they didn't need a piece of paper from the city hall, as Joni Mitchell would like to sing. They needed really to talk about their history, their landscapes as being managed by them and having historical rights. So it's a completely different mechanism through which rights were claimed and ratified. The other thing is that these, through their use of and engagement with many different kinds of societies, kind of had at its heart the idea of multiple modernities. Now we can get into a big fight over what we mean by modernities, but that's for seminar rooms. For the moment, just trust me on this. The other thing is that in terms of Amazonia, and it sort of set off a kind of a popcorn explosion of constitutionalism as the authoritarian regimes retracted for a while. As I mentioned, land rights and historic claims through traditional tenure and so on. New forms of institutions. There weren't environmental institutions per se. There could have been a forestry ministry, but they weren't really thinking about it in an environmental way, but rather in a resource extraction way. A whole new array of civil society and state institutions pertaining to Amazonia. Some were built on traditional models of institutions, state institutions, but others were novel, local, and others were globalized. So if you start to think about things like RED, reduced emissions for deforestation and degradation, or payment for environmental service, these are kind of novel, relatively novel things, but inserted into a globalized framework. So the point is that this new model is not simply a model about Brazil, but it also incarnates many larger questions. There's a deep epistemic change, which is that inhabited forests are seen as having conservation value. So in a certain sense, it overrides a lot of the conservation history by saying humans can actually manage tropical forests in ways that enhance or improve or at least sustain their environmental services, their biodiversity, their climate mediating capacities, and that just having a forest primeval, even if it's just an imaginary problem, is not a viable way forward. This is a very, very profound shift in the way this goes forward. The other, of course, is this idea of the sort of third way, the social lives of forests, the social histories of forests, and also a science-inflected development and shift from the sort of natural history and Boy's own story to more scientific, remote sensing, and increasingly narrative histories. Also, what affected this was the rise of climate change science and politics, the recognition of environmental services, massive shifts in the archaeological and ecological history that we're seeing, and also socio-environmentalism as an idea. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this. New laws, new markets, environmental markets, ecological and social markets, much more extensive social movements, articulation, lots of other kinds of questions, but the idea of a green governance in the tropics. And what this does is it incarnates a new map, and that's what that map looks like. So what you see here is a kind of the socio-environmental green map of the mega Amazonia, Pan-Amazonia. And you can see that this is actually an extraordinary shift from Amazonia as a big green blot on the map, able to be exploited in any way that you preferred. That is a terra nullius. Well, all of that sort of gives you, history really begins in 1988 in most of these things. But what you can see is that it's, goes up and down for a while. But as the institutional and political framework consolidates, you get this very extraordinary decline. And of course, once you start about here with the rise, with the political complications associated with the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff and the rise of Bolsonaro, you also see a rise in deforestation. So what we have here is also, while that socio-environmental stuff was going on, the developmentalist model did not go away. It simply didn't have, let's say, quite the publicists that the other ones did. But what you can see is that the plans were in place for a lot of stuff, and that these were actually in place from the military period. So these didn't just like pop out. I remember going into a room in Brasilia where all the Amazon plans were. And if you've ever seen some of the Brazilian movies, there's one in which there's an archive of the dead, but actually it's the archive of the living, but they just pretend to be dead. So it's kind of a zombie movie, but anyway, never mind. But the point here is that you can see that this is a natural resource and high intervention mapping, and there's more that I could put on. I could put on the roads as well, but this is the real bovine face, the face of Amazonian conquest as a bovine one, largest land use, and essentially it's used to show it's low labor, it's flexible in lots of different ways, small as well as large scale producers can engage in it. It's got some kind of market pretty much all the time. But its most important role really is showing effective use. That is to say that if you have cattle and grass running around, then you can show that you're actually using this, and your claims for land grabbing and your claims for tenurial dominance become much more valorized. Another thing that Euclides da Cunha talked about was about the oligarchic groups in both Brazil and Peru as being the builders of ruins, and essentially arguing that through the forest destruction that they were promoting, they made the place ultimately uninhabitable. And so while we still have the soybean going forward, the use of glyphosate all over and drenching it in glyphosate, the Oaxacans have always, Mexico has such wonderful skeletal artistic things that I couldn't resist using this. But the question about transgenic soy, corn, cotton complex and glyphosate as a biocide has enormously transformed the region, not just in the area where they're growing soy, because there's drift, it moves around. And even though it is argued that it's not toxic, actually it's a carcinogen for humans, as Bayer is finding out. But that it also moves around the ecosystem much more than was previously understood. So that's a soy landscape for you. And the problems of a fragmented forest. We won't go into this. But also, I think sometimes we forget that we concentrate on soy, and partly if you're Brazilian, you like to do that, but that oil palm is now Brazil and Colombia and Peru and Ecuador are becoming major oil palm producers. And again, this is a tree crop, monocrop, but it has many of the same flaws and also requires the reduction and deforestation of massive areas of tropical forest. So there's another sort of, I'm just putting this on to give you a sense of the current scramble here that is currently going forward. And you can see that, and you can find in much of the literature how much of this, particularly in the Western Amazon, is now going forward. This is also, Amazonia can be very easily understood as one of the most important hydrocarbon frontiers now. Okay. So what has happened really since about 2012 is big shifts in the political climate and a more generalized authoritarian movement. The failure of the development policies in other regions to really deliver on what was seen as the mass consumption goods of development simply hasn't occurred in an even way. It's enhanced inequalities and also extreme environmental degradation, and hasn't really pulled together much by way of linked industrial dynamics. The other thing is that Amazonia has become extremely important in all the Amazon countries for its foreign exchange. It reflects the China double shock, which is when China went into the global market in 1990, they had these great and really cheap manufacturers. It simply swamped the incipient and not particularly well-developed industrial manufacture sector in the Amazon countries. And also, China began to become a central trading partner. It became important as an investor and also a major sort of sub rosa political actor and large scale, not just private investor, but state investor. What were some of the kinds of things that this involved? Well, I always like to say, people always pretend there was no metallurgy in Amazonia. I beg to differ. This is a Tirona gold thing. But the uneven development policies and the inequality produced shadow clandestine and unstable economies at multiple scales. So the new forms of accumulation revolve around dispossession, deforestation, and clandestine economies. Yes, there are those really big legal economies, but these are probably equal in their magnitude. So I'm actually writing another book, the sort of sequel to Fate of the Forest and Scramble, which is about the modern one, which is land grabbing and land frauds are rife. Land speculation becomes a major driver of deforestation. One sort of feature of that is a lot of illegal logging. There's lots of contraband of multiple types. Most of the, well, about half the mining, depending on where you are, but almost all of it in other places is illegal, and that gives you what that gold mining looks like. The problems in each of these governments is corruption. I think Peru went through 3 presidents in 2 weeks this last summer. There's tons of illegal clearing on conservation areas and indigenous lands. It's become very violent, and we have high rates of internal and urban migration. So we're seeing a lot of instability. And one of the things that's really important is from both the bottom and the top, using Amazonia as a form of accumulation becomes extremely important. So essentially what we're seeing is when I showed you that decline of deforestation, what we saw was really how regulation and social movements and social organizations and enforcement of laws actually really did result in decline in deforestation. There's another story about that too, which has to do with leakage. I can't go into that now. But what you see now is a kind of a policy experiment, a natural experiment, which is remove the support from the processes outlined in the last slide. And what you get is a lot of deforestation. So what we've had is policy rollbacks, no enforcement, no protected areas demarcations, no environmental cost or externality accounting. Research has been deforested. And it's a kind of an eco-necropolitics, and COVID hasn't helped. So what you get is this, and instead of that handsome decline that we saw, a rise in deforestation. Here's, this is Cerro Pelada. This is formal mining. Looks great. This is from, the 1980s. This is the modern mining that you can see, which is done under, this is, of course, in Peru. The other one was in the Carajás. But a lot of these monies end up being, first of all, they are deeply entwined with legal systems. So they have a life in the illegal or clandestine world and then move in. Then they're easily laundered through land or through banks. And I just wanted to give you a sense also of that the dynamics of deforestation and land use change has shifted. I use this visible infrared imaging radiometer to give you a sense of how much understory fires are now part of the story. It's sort of a pre-board for when you actually clear, but the point is that you can see this is moving all over the place. It's in indigenous reserves and certainly munching around the edges of it. And of course, in places along the roads, you see virtually all of these kinds of clearing. And this is Peru, and I'm not going to go, I think Tasso will be talking about that. I'm almost done here. There's a couple of things I want to point out. Assimilation is the indigenous policy, a lot of degazetting of conservation areas, that is making them not conservation areas anymore, amnesty for cleared areas and conservation areas of all types, the idea of privatizing agricultural research and deforestation assessment, and of course, last May, the overriding of environmental licensing for projects considered of national security or national interest. I'm not going to go into this too much, mainly to point out that the abandonment of the idea of alternative and multiple modernities in favor of agro-industrial mining interests has been sort of the hallmark of regional development in Pan-Amazonia. And also the rise of hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, and so on, means that, and Chinese funds, has meant that there's been a loss of control over financial levers in these areas, and also an explosion in the infrastructure system. This is just merely to give you a sense of these things. Also, I'm not going to go into this, but I'd like to close up a little bit on the final point I would like to make, which is that, first of all, one of the things that we sort of feel from all of this is how extraordinary pre-Columbian societies have been and their implications. The second is that indigenous and traditional is not niche. It's not a romantic little thing that we all just love because we are Luddites at heart. It's important to understand the role of indigenous knowledge in the formation of European sciences, and there's really a lot of study of this. It's important to understand the role of Amazonian germplasm as globally transformative. You can think of quinine for tropical colonialism, manioc for enhancing African caloric availability, sweet potato in Asian caloric availability, and rubber for the Industrial Revolution. You could not have had it without rubber. So in this sense, it has actually shaped the modern world in ways that we don't understand, or we don't pay attention to it. The other thing is that Amazonia has foundational, I'm not even talking about the medicinals or hallucinogenic or anything else, although it does have to be said that coca and gold are among the most valuable commodities in global exchange right now. So under Amazonian contributions have been emphasized, mainly because indigeneity and traditional people were seen as being out time, as well as part of a land without history. So that they were just sort of, like kind of fun, but not really consequential. The other thing is that if you still have 300 ethnicities, in spite of more than 90% of the population being undone, perhaps we might want to think about what kind of knowledge systems and what kind of strategies populations use when they confront collapses. The other thing is many Amazonian countries have majority indigenous populations or majority Black populations. So one of the things is this idea of that somehow the only civilizational functional dynamic would come from outside of Amazonia really needs to be assessed. The other thing I would point out too is that
Susanna, we're totally out of time. I'm very sorry.
All right, I'm going to just make my last point here, which is indigenous movements have traditional political skills, and it's a serious, not a romantic rethink of strategies. And I just will say this, Minerva's owls fly at dusk. We will see what happens, but as Euclides da Cunha also said, such is its history, such is the river, always turbulent, always insurgent. So I leave you with that. I'm going to stop sharing. Sorry for going over.
Thank you. No problem. Thank you very much for that insightful talk. And we'll turn our attention very quickly to our next panel.